Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basic. All right, I am really happy to be here with Jennifer Lucido. And thank you, Jennifer, for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You are welcome. Well, just a little background on Jennifer. Jennifer Lucido, M.A., is a graduate of the Cultural Resources Management Program at Sonoma State University. Her master's thesis reviewed the documentary and archaeological records of the Royal Presidio of San Carlos de Monterey. In her thesis, Jennifer demonstrated that the colonial landscape of the Presidio Monterey was formed through a diverse array of physical and cultural processes during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. She's published a number of academic papers on the Presidio and is second author in a recent paper with Dr. Ruben Mendoza, whom you heard on the podcast, dealing with Spanish cultural origins of mission architecture in California. Jennifer's scholarly contributions in furthering the preservation and protection of the California missions were acknowledged by the California Mission Curators and Directors Conference with the granting of the Father Fermín Francisco de la Suen Award for 2014. Presently, Jennifer is serving as an adjunct instructor in social and behavioral sciences at California State University, Monterey Bay. And so that means that she is another CSU comadre. And Jennifer, I know because she is a prolific scholar, has written a lot of articles, done some amazing work. And of course, I've had the privilege of meeting Jennifer at California missions conferences, et cetera. So I am really excited to have her on today and talk about some of the work that you've been doing most recently, which involves the African descendant presence in California. But and we're going to talk about that and anything else that you want to talk about. But I thought maybe if it's fine with you, we could talk a little bit about your background and what got you into archaeology in the first place.
Yeah, a bit cliche, but Hollywood was definitely an influence with Indiana Jones and, oddly enough, Jurassic Park. I don't know which one I saw first as a child, but they were both part of my world. And so the fantasy of it was a huge influence as a child, and that later developed into Egyptology. And I at one point wanted to be an Egyptologist. And so I actually would read as much of at least the popular literature that was out there about ancient Egypt, and even taught myself the hieroglyphic alphabet. And so I would write notes just using the alphabet. And I saw myself as an Egyptologist. And at some point, I think I don't know, if I had different conversations with my parents and they're kind of like, well, how are you going to make a living in archaeology? And we don't see this as realistic. And so that went away for a while. And then it wasn't until I came to CSU Monterey Bay where I was like, oh, I can pursue a degree in this and I can study archaeology. And of course, that was under Dr. Ruben Mendoza. And the irony for me was that his area was Spanish colonialism and the missions in California. And for me, I actually had gone to school at San Carlos Mission, the Carmel Mission, and from kindergarten to 8th grade. And so I had my own sort of mission experience. And having had that experience, I really wanted nothing to do with the mission. And so finally, I was excited as a young adult to be able to pursue archaeology. And then, of course, the subject matter was something that I thought I already knew everything about. And of course, from a Catholic perspective, since it was a Catholic private school. But I was actually very disappointed initially. And it wasn't until I started reading the literature and then Dr. Mendoza taking us out to the different missions and excavating at Mission Soledad that I realized I think I want to pursue this more seriously. And that's essentially what I've been focused on for over 10 years now. I'm trying to think, probably closer to 14 years now that I've been focused on and looking at different areas. And so he always sort of would talk about, Dr. Mendoza would talk about, I guess, the shadow, living under the shadow of the pyramids sort of phenomenon. And so for me, having gone to a mission at a school and having had the local history in terms of Spanish colonialism, that was never an area of interest. And it was always like the exotic ancient Egypt that I would after. And then once I realized, no, there's a lot of history here and there's a lot of stories to be told, it sort of balanced it for me. Like, no, you don't have to go far away. You can look at what's in your own backyard. And so that's kind of what brought me to history and archaeology in this area of my own hometown. And it's just kind of ironic to me because, of course, it started with Indiana Jones, but I soon learned that it's pure fantasy.
Well, I know I wanted to be Indiana Jones too.
Yeah.
Though I didn't have that moment like you did. So I wound up on the literature side of things. But if I had a professor like Ruben, that may have happened to me too. But I think that the fact that you're from Monterey and that you're working on what is in your local area, I think gives a real advantage, right? Because you can go, you know the area and you can go deeper and you can have a more granular approach. So I think that is really where probably why you've been able to be so prolific in what you write and what you do. Was there a moment, do you remember if there was a light bulb moment or something like that, or a particular site you were at or a particular document you looked at that really kind of made you think, okay, this could be the area for me to work on?
I think for me, it probably goes back to the field experience. And one of the questions I often get asked is what's the coolest thing I've discovered or excavated? And for me, it was always the little tiny objects. And in particular, I remember at Mission Soledad excavating shell beads and glass bead that were associated with the neophyte housing there where the Selenian peoples and others were living at the mission. And it was so small. And then kind of like, I think a metaphor for like, okay, it can be something as small as a bead that can have so much to say. And in the case of Monterey, and at least in terms of the literature, I wasn't seeing much on Monterey. But San Diego, Francisco, Santa Barbara, and it's kind of like, well, there's a lot here and no one's talking about Monterey and so much happened here. And so that sort of pushed me to see what could I find, at least in historical record, archaeological record, specific to Monterey. And a lot of my students, because I do teach different classes in archaeology and history, they know nothing of this area. And so it's really a learning experience for them to realize that, okay, there's history here. And some of them are from those bigger areas like Santa Barbara, San Francisco, or maybe more LA based. And so they also have that sort of living in the shadows of the pyramid scenario going on where they just don't look for anything. And so my hope is like, okay, if you can have it in your backyard too, then maybe, you'll be more inquisitive or try to find more what's there. This is sort of reminding me now of another exercise that I do with students I call it Colonialism in Me, where I have students look up using, I think it's native maps or native digital maps. I'm blanking on the platform off the top of my head. But to have them look up the different indigenous groups of where they live based on their address. And they always say like, oh, I'm completely unfamiliar with this group. Like, okay, why we're doing this? Just awareness, if nothing else, is a good starting place.
Just down in Southern California, and I met up with Eric Plunkett, who I've had on the podcast, and he's done so much with just, he can walk around and tell you, look, at this is where this village was and that village, and the person who shows up in this document came from this settlement, et cetera. And to me, it's almost like putting on VR glasses or something, right? Or what do you want to call it? Like when Pokemon Go was big and you walk around, right? And you see all these things superimposed. And so you're like, walk around and you have an awareness that this landscape is the traditional home of many, many different people. And there's a whole culture that goes back hundreds, thousands of years, and multiple cultures. So yeah, I mean, that's really cool. And Monterey was such an important place, but I guess that's the thing is oftentimes when you're from a place, your local surroundings just seem like, boring.
Yeah.
But the other stuff is interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess that's normal human experience, right?
Yeah, definitely. And like I had mentioned, I had gone to school at a mission, and so it was even less so on my radar.
Right, exactly. Well, and in fact, here we go. I'm getting on another soapbox, is I feel like we need to study early California history later also, right? I feel like when you're older, you can get more of the nuance and more of the details about all the different things that were happening here. And fourth graders are fourth graders, so they just kind of, you have to give the basic, very unnuanced, uncontextualized story.
I always ask my students, I say, oh, how many of you are from California? Did you remember your fourth grade experience? And they say yes. And, what did you get out of that? And they usually don't have much to offer. And I think of my own fourth grade experience, especially since it was at a mission. And it was, again, because of the Catholic school, it was a huge emphasis on the Catholic conversion component and from the Catholic perspective, seeing that as a positive thing. And also at the same time, I remember being shown a video. I don't remember what it was. It was supposed to represent, Junipero Serra coming to California. And my takeaway from that video as a child was like, how strange that these colonists come to California and they're all speaking the same languages. They're having no problem communicating. And even so as a child, I was like, this is weird. This doesn't seem to connect. And yet that's just kind of how it was being taught to me. And I don't know that I saw that as odd, but I don't think I really questioned it. And it wasn't, again, till higher education that I was like, okay, there's a lot more to the story. And I always tell my students, there's what we know is still just a drop in the bucket.
Right. The more you learn, the more you find out you don't know very much. So yeah, you lately, or at least over the last couple of years, have been working on a family, a descendant of one woman who came. Well, I'll let you talk about her and her descendants, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is it really focuses on the presence of African descendants in Alta California. I guess in the Californias, but in Alta California. Could you talk a little bit about that and how this project came about and where you're going with it?
So, and in terms of sort of the African history in California, I know a lot of my students and I think the general public are really not familiar with that at all. And when we think of Spanish colonialism, immediately they go to white Europeans straight from Spain, right off the boat into California. And then that's that.
With helmets, conquistador helmets, and yeah.
And so part of my undergraduate experience was learning about the sistema de castas, or the caste system, in which the different colonists were labeled and assigned. I don't like calling them the same as like racial labels today, but they're sort of more of the social and racial labels that were given to people. And in the context of New Spain and in Mexico, you have people of Spanish ancestry, people of indigenous, and then of course people of African. And the African is coming from the slave trade into the New World. And so by the time we get to California, you have, over 200 years of African presence in the New World, and that those are the descendants who are now coming into California. And so part of my interest was to find out, at least to the extent that I could from historical documentation, who were these people? Where were they coming from? Why were they coming to California? Or at least what could I infer might be their motive? And what happened when they were in California? And so that stemmed a lot from my master's thesis, where I was focused on the soldier population and looking at what their custas were prior to coming to California, while they were initially in California, and then once they were settled, and basically documenting how those labels changed, and essentially going from whatever the label they had previously to becoming whitewashed, essentially, and identifying as Spanish. And that could be, interpreted as both ethnically Spanish or national identity. And so for me, one part, again, that stood out to me was the African heritage, because that's just not part of the main narrative. And again, there's still that assumption that all white Europeans coming to California. And I always like to remind students, like, no, you can't have a population that has had 200 plus years with colonialism to be these so-called pure population. And when you have different populations being brought in the case of Africans being trafficked into slavery, then they too are going to, over time, integrate into existing populations with indigenous Spanish and also others. You also have an Asian heritage there too. And that, again, 200 years later, that population is going to look a little bit differently. And coming to California, that comes with them. In terms of maybe looking at individuals, I think that also comes from my thesis work, where that's what I had to do. I was literally tracking down individual names through their different records, whether it was census records or the mission, baptismal, marriage, death record, or even godparents, trying to see if I could find their identities and how they changed. And in the case of Feliciana, who's the main subject of one of my more recent publications, she was connected to another colleague that I actually have here at PSU Monterey, Scott Leiden, who was a direct ancestor. And doing conversations with him and other ancestor or descendants rather, I learned about this woman, and that one of her claims to fame, or in terms of that's made her infamous, is that she has this African identity. And so for some people, that's something they didn't want to highlight in their heritage, and for others, they wanted to know more about them. And so part of this, in working with descendants, was trying to see what more can I find out about their particular ancestor, and then it went from there.
Tell us a little bit about Maria Feliciana and how she came to California. And
yeah, so she was initially part of the Dianza expedition, and so the group of settlers coming from New Spain to basically become civilians of California. And some of what I had tracked down with her background was that she likely enlisted with her husband, but I'm blanking off the top of my head. He passed away. So she was then in a situation where she was a widow with 2 young children, now traveling from Spain to California with this massive expedition led by Captain Dianza, and to start anew. And so what she experienced on her journey also called negative attention, where apparently there was a situation where the expedition broke into different caravans, and then I guess they lost contact, and then eventually they were connected again. And so in her case, when they were connected, they had a big celebration of some sort, at least according to the record. And so she sang a song, which I wish I had the lyrics to it. I don't think that was recorded, but it was described as being not appropriate. And because it was inappropriate, she was essentially punished with one of the male travelers that she was with at the time. That kind of puts her in the record because when they had the celebration and singing this inappropriate song, now she's literally being documented as, okay, this woman who was a widow singing this inappropriate song. And by the way, she also has this African, at least an African Castile label. And so to me, all of that was very interesting. And so I wanted to see, how does someone who is basically, who's a woman who's starting over and not even Californian, is already getting into trouble. And so I liked that. I like someone who's kind of a troublemaker, calling attention to themselves, and how is she going to respond to this new world? And so a lot of what I was looking at is trying to follow her record in California and see with the two daughters that she brought with her, where did their life trajectories go, and then follow their descendants. And a lot of the descendants, are, or at least her two daughters from her first marriage, for the descendants that were massive names in California, like the Vallejos and Carrillos and others. And so it's like she becomes a very important mother figure, and she's easy to follow because of this scenario that she got herself in, and calling attention to herself by singing this inappropriate song. And so a lot of what I've been trying to do, at least in the past few years, is sort of see, like, again, follow her trajectory in California, but also try to find some of her life before California. And that's been a lot more challenging.
Where did she wind up settling in Alta California?
So when the expedition made their way, or she actually, Feliciana did not follow through with the rest of the expedition, and she ended up marrying a soldier at Mission San Gabriel, and then moving from there. And so largely sort of in more Southern California, where she is focused. And then her daughters, as they became of age to marry, also moved around California.
You talked earlier about the casta system in New Spain, and you also talked about how people's casta that they were assigned, could and did change over time. What was that? How did that happen? I've read some things, but what did you learn about that in terms of people in Alta California, let's say, coming as whatever label, mulatto, mestizo, español, indio, whatever it might be, and then later you mentioned the fact that maybe they became whitewashed, in so many words. What was going on?
So in terms with the caste system in sort of New Spain or Mexico proper, like there is at least 40 different labels, and how those labels were recorded would be in the different church records, so baptism, marriage, death, or godparent. And those labels continued into California, but they weren't enforced. And if you look at different, again, mission records, you'll see that sometimes they weren't even recorded at all. And so it's not until we have official census record where we sort of see a reemergence of these labels. But of the 40 or so labels that were out there, only 6 make it to, the new frontier, essentially. And so that in itself is pretty telling that it wasn't as critical or seen as necessary to record. And when it was recorded, you could see changes where people would essentially become a different casta, such as going from mulata to española. And so sort of the general kind of scholarly interpretation is that people were identifying more with being in California or distinguishing them from indigenous people. And so I always sort of tease my students, say, like, in one way it's super progressive because they're saying, like, we don't identify with these labels that we came from, in Mexico, and that we are changing them, but at the same time they are still distinguishing themselves from the indigenous population. And so they would use labels in a way to sort of reinforce those differences, even though those labels had diminished from the motherland, so to speak. And so when I look at the different census records, that's often the pattern where I see basically one label becoming more whitewashed or Spanish, because at the end of the day, I think most people would, if they could identify as Espanol or Spanish, then they would, even if that's not what their background was. At the same time, though, you also have, I always tell my students, you have to take these labels with a grain of salt because they're very subjective, and that in some cases, people's castas would change through marriage. And so kind of coming back to Feliciana, I've identified her from her casta as mulata, but in actuality, it's possible that that was just a label. And so it gets kind of slippery, where it's like, on one end, you have the recognition of different ethnic groups, but of course they have social and racial implication. And then you have the whitewashing of them, where it's then gearing any possible ethnic diversity. And that is something that to me is fascinating. So it's like, I've been interested to sort of track those changes through the different records and in the mission system and the census record. And one thing that's notable too is in the 1790 census, there was about 1,000 settlers that were documented, and less than half even had Costa label. And so again, that's pretty telling that it just wasn't as important in California as it was in Mexico or even other colonies of New Spain. And so that, to me, like that's always been interesting to look at, to see, like, can I find that change? Did this person change? A question that also I think is legitimate to ask is, to what extent did people actually have the influence themselves to identify, or was it just somebody else making an assumption about their identity and assigning them that label? That is still unclear.
That's what I was about to ask you next, were these labels that whoever was recording the document just assigned, or did they have the choice or the agency to say, this is how I identify in terms of my casta, right? And so it's not clear still.
Yeah, I think it was probably a little bit of both, because in Mexico, New Spain, I imagine that if someone really wanted to interrogate someone's background, then they could look at the records and say, like, oh, here it is, you are documented as this, therefore you result in this casta. But in California, those records aren't there. And so there might be a little bit of, like one of the missionaries or other priests officiants saying, like, how do you identify, or simply making an assumption based on how they perceive them. And so I suspect it was a combination of both. And I know Barbara Voss in her research, the Costa systems at the Presidio of San Francisco, has also sort of made the statement that it could have just been more expedient to not act, or just do whatever it thought.
And that's the interesting thing too, is that it's understandable that maybe these categories change over generations because, of course, people have different parents, the families fuse, and then, of course, there's a change that's noted or that's applied. But the interesting thing in Alta California is exactly that these changes apply to individuals in their lifetime, right? Who come with one category and then later on, as they're older, merge into another category, let's say. So yeah, you mentioned Barbara Voss, and I've read some of her work on ethnogenesis, and you also use that word in the title of one of your articles. Can you explain this concept? I think this has to do with what we're talking about right now, this change. Can you explain a little bit about ethnogenesis and what it is?
Yeah. So ethnogenesis is essentially creating a new identity, and that identity, kind of borrowing from ethnos, like ethnic identity, but it could also refer to sort of new cultural identity. And so Barbara Voss was focused on looking at what was this new identity formation process like at Presidio of San Francisco. And that inspired for me to look at Presidio of Monterey to see like, okay, is this phenomenon happening here? And how can I document that? And that's where, again, the Costa records come back into play, because I can see, okay, the new identity that's basically being created, and this is more of a California-wide phenomenon, is that the Costa system is declining, and in being the new identity to replace that was the first the people of reason, gente de razón. And again, that was sort of a collective identity. But then, as I mentioned before, it sounds progressive initially, like, right, we're not going to use these labels. We're all going to be the people of reason. But then you can't be the people of reason without comparing yourself to another group. And so, of course, indigenous peoples were considered people without reason. And so there's still that discrepancy, and they're still using identity to distinguish from others. But it's interesting how it becomes more generalized that way instead of the different Costas. And then eventually we see the Californio identity, which is kind of like another ethnogenesis way, where we, again, identifying with the state or the colony of California rather than racial or other ethnic backgrounds, and also as a way to distinguish from New Spain or Mexico. And so it's like really more identifying the land and the place. And so those are some of the different processes that we've seen, that Barbara Voss has seen, and I've seen in Monterey. And one thing that's also interesting, kind of to jump back to some of the Costa records in California, is that in the 1790 record, some of the Costas that are recorded compared to the ones that are in the marriage or other mission record kind of revert back. So it's like you see already the change in California, people identifying as gente de razón, or a more whitewashed identity like Spanish. And then when this official census comes in, suddenly it's gone back to, or maybe gone back, who knows? It's a very different Costa. And so again, it kind of comes back to like who is perceiving what and who is presenting themselves as something else. And so one of the arguments that I've made, and that I believe Barbara Voss also makes, is that being in a frontier like California was for the Spanish colonists, like that basically gave them the opportunity to sort of exploit the distance from New Spain to change their identities. But it's interesting to kind of see how, like, when you're in a frontier landscape, that there's these opportunities. And some of the theory behind ethnogenesis is that, like, it's like a push-pull sort of dynamic, where you're leaving one place and then everything sort of starts anew, including how you identify.
So what did you see with, and you mentioned that you studied some of Feliciana's granddaughters, right? What did you see with her descendants, say 1, 2, 3 generations out? Did this process continue in terms of change of identities? I imagine it might have.
Yes, so we definitely basically see like one that's coming to mind is like in the Pico family, like basically identifying as Spanish, but I think by the time we get to 2 or 3 generations past Feliciana, then it's more of the Californio identity and more of that than anything else, but still sort of like acknowledging the Spanish roots. But again, Spanish would be more nationality and not necessarily ethnically. Um, and so I think it's interesting that, uh, there's sort of like, I guess, like an internalized racism happening in that way too, where it's like you still don't want to acknowledge what the ethnic diversity of your ancestors were and still choosing an identity that basically obscures that, which is one of the reasons why I think it's really fascinating to study the Costa systems and to look at the Costa records or wherever I can find the Costa information, because you can get a better sense of like, even if the Costa label is not accurate, which it's very likely that it's not, it still tells us that, these groups were ethnically diverse. Yes, it's due to colonialism. Yes, it's due to situations that, we try to look at and criticize today. But it's interesting that, we see how it's being documented and then how people step away from it. And it's only through kind of going back into these records that you realize, okay, even though this person is identifying as Spanish, that's not really what these records say. But again, you still have to be careful. I know John Johnson did a study where he tested some of the DNA of descendants and compared them with their ancestors' Costa labels, and he found a lot of discrepancies, which is not surprising to me at all. And so I always kind of like to tease the fact that it is possible that Feliciana is not of African ancestry, but the point is that you still want to acknowledge the African ancestry, regardless if that was her ethnic backbone or not, because that's still part of the history that gets obscured when we have labels that like California,
right,
or Spanish.
Right, exactly. Well, exactly. When you think about society in Mexico or New Spain at the time in the 18th century, let's say, I mean, that's a place with, as you mentioned, right? You have so many different indigenous populations from all over the territory, and then of course you have the African element that comes in with slavery, and then you have free blacks also, and you have, of course, Spanish from the peninsula, and then you have Spanish descendants, and then all of these different permutations, intermarrying, or having children, and so and then we're in the Enlightenment too. So there's also kind of this idea of we want to catalog everything, we want to identify everything, and we're going to figure it all out. But then, right, you come to the far northern frontier, and people are just, they're trying to make a new life. They're trying to survive. And all of that kind of, that infrastructure is gone. And so, you can start, you can try and start anew. I'm wondering, and maybe this is further afield than you've gone, but what about descendants into the post-annexation, the post-statehood period? Have you done any work on that and how their identities coalesce or change or evolve?
I haven't, but I at least based on conversations, just casual conversations with descendants in general, I feel that there's more of a pride in taking on sort of like the Spanish heritage, but I don't know the extent to which some of those descendants have really looked into more the diversity of it. And I feel that, since that is a little more out of the scope of what I looked at, I would assume that the sort of whitewashing of identity would continue. And what to me is ironic is that if you do have descendants today who firmly believe like, oh yes, this is the Spanish descendants or Spanish ancestry, it's almost to me, it's ironic that like their ancestors, by changing their Costa labels or challenging their Costa labels or having identities that obscured any other type of ethnic background, was so efficient that today descendants still believe that is what they are. Which is why to me this is important research, because it's kind of like, trying to peel back those layers of like, no, these are very ethnically diverse groups, and that even if the labels are inaccurate, it still tells us something about the diversity of the people there.
Yeah, and I think today now with genealogy becoming so advanced, and then you throw in the DNA element, I think a lot of people really are discovering, the different sides of their ancestry, and hopefully, also honoring that as well. I also, once, and maybe you were there at one of the missions conferences, we had a speaker who was a native, a Hashman or Kumia, I don't remember now, and he was very proudly a member of that native community. But he also mentioned the fact that one of his great grandparents had been a Spanish soldier that came with Sarah, So a lot of it too is what group you sort of feel you're belonging to, right? And I think that's another thing. We're so focused today on let's say DNA or on biology, for good and bad reasons, right? That we forget that people's identity up until very recently was more about whom you belong to rather than, or what group you are a part of rather than sort of your genetics, right? Because you didn't know what your genetics were. You just knew who your parents were and your grandparents and your cousins, So it's an interesting time period when you can sort of now put all those things together. So
Absolutely.
When you teach your students, what do you see a change, or do you see how do they respond to learning about California archaeology through your classes? What kind of reactions do you get from students there at Monterey Bay?
I think a lot of them are surprised and then confused, where it's again, if they're from California, then that wasn't their fourth grade experience. And then at the same time, I have a lot of descendants who are in my classes, and for some of them, it's just a learning experience for them. Like, they didn't know the complications in their among their ancestors, like whether they're indigenous or the colonial Spanish side, and so I think for them it's really just like an overall learning experience. And I know that for a lot of the narratives when it comes to colonialism can be very polarized, and so there was also religion that people have, and I have religious students, and so it's kind of, I know for some students they might feel a little torn, like they're grappling with some of their own identity based on sort of what we talk about in class. And so for me, I always tell students, like, if you leave my class more confused, then I'm happy. Because as long as to me, it's not a black and white narrative, and there's so much complexities, and that if they can at least have a better understanding that this is this was a complex time, and that everything that happened still affects us in the present still, and how it affects people in the present is different, but depending on their maybe ethnic or racial identity, and that at least maybe they can have a better understanding of the present by what we talk about in the past. And that's something that I think is what I've seen the most. I think, that's mostly kind of like a learning experience.
Yeah, I think so too. I see some of those things with my students. It's been a few years since I've taught a class specifically on California. I hope to go back to doing that pretty soon. But I remember it was, for many students, it's such an eye-opener, especially many of our students are either immigrants themselves or first-generation families of immigrants, to realize that this place that we're in is, well, first of all, it's always been, a place where to which people come, I suppose the native people who've been here for thousands of years, that might be a different case, but they also came at a certain point, right? So that aspect. And then also, I also see students who identify, when you start to tease out the stories of the people, for example, that came with ANSA, or they're like, oh, wow, this reminds me of my parents' life, or my own life back in where we came from in Michoacan, let's say. I don't know, and so
yes.
There's oftentimes a realization that this is your place, this is, and just like with my own family, as I dig into my own family history, I realize, oh yeah, it is real complicated, right? There's the stories that you hear as a child that are simple, because a child needs simple information, but as you get older and you get able to grasp more context, more nuance, you're like, oh wow, that I had no idea, and it's much more interesting that way, in my opinion. When there are multiple layers, when you're aware of the conflicts that happened. So yeah, I think I think you're doing something really important and probably fairly unique in helping students learn about California, the Monterey area, through archaeology and through history and getting out there. And also, do you lead? Do you take them out in the field?
I unfortunately do not. I have extra credit assignments for them to go to different missions and sort of make critiques based on, conversations we've had in class, but the field component is no longer something that we do.
Yeah. I imagine there's something to do with COVID there too, and all sorts of different rules and regulations. Liabilities. Yes. Not to get off on a tangent, but I remember very early on when I started at my school, like hearing the guy from risk management talking about, no field trips, or if you do something, you have to meet somewhere and have to sign multiple documents, etc. So yeah, it makes it really hard to have those kind of experiences now.
Yeah. And actually, you just reminded me. So I guess this is what COVID's done now. I did have a class. We didn't do field work, but we would do museum visits, and so that was, I guess, the closest to what we could do. In addition to encouraging students to go to missions and complete kind of extra credit assignments, but unfortunately, that class where I would do that hasn't been offered since COVID. And so it makes it more challenging. But that was another, I think, eye-opening experience for students, because, and actually what I think is the coolest thing about being in Monterey, and probably, anywhere really, but it's like when we can talk about different issues, or we can talk about locations, and then I take them there. And then it becomes more real for them, because it's like, okay, we were just talking about this. Now we're going to go there. And now you can see different components for yourself and get a little more immersive experience. But yes, that unfortunately hasn't been possible since COVID.
Based on the research you've done, what would you say is the big takeaway in terms of the Casta experience, the Black experience of early California, and understanding our circumstance, our place, or understanding this place now?
One of the major takeaways is especially in today's world, because we are trying to acknowledge diversity and make sure that marginalized peoples have their voices being heard, that the CASTA system is in studying it is one way as like a historical archaeologist where I can try to identify those more marginalized groups and give them a voice in the present. And the irony is that in California, those backgrounds, those castas were suppressed, changed, and then eventually eliminated. And so it's sort of this trying to go back into the past and look for these identities that have huge colonial implications, but they're also telling the story of this diversity that we wouldn't otherwise have in the present. And especially in the present, when we're trying to lift all voices together and be part of the narrative, that's where I hope my research contributes in that area. And especially with the African history, because again, that's a component that I don't feel is very well acknowledged in the Spanish colonial history in California. And a lot of what we see is indigenous versus Spanish colonist kind of narratives. And those are important narratives to look at, but then it's still just a piece of the puzzle. And so by looking at the CASTA system, it gives us a little more of the picture and a better sense of the diversity. And there's far more questions that remain unanswered. Like, I'm very curious to know, to what extent did African culture continue into California, at least in terms of what was continued by different descendants in Mexico into California. That's something that I don't know anything about, but it didn't disappear. It couldn't have disappeared, right? But we can't begin to look for those aspects if we don't know that they're there to begin with, or could potentially be there. And so a lot of what I think learning from the CASTA system is just kind of looking to retrace the diversity. And even though the CASTA system is deeply flawed, it still allows us to acknowledge that and then make sure that's part of the narrative.
That is really interesting, the way you put that the CASTA system itself being deeply flawed, but 200 years later, you can look back on it and it can be a tool to reveal the diversity of the people, the populations, the cultures that came here, and spur more investigation, more research, and give us a more complete picture of this place that we're in. And I think that's really important, because so often like I said, I think it's good that students study California history in fourth grade, but I think they really should be doing it later when they can get more in depth on these topics and have a more complete and accurate picture of this place and how it fits into the rest of the world and the hemisphere and the continent. And there's so much there to tease out. So that's why I love talking to people like you. I love reading and learning about this stuff and going, as you mentioned, going to the places where you can see, touch, feel the presence of all of this past, which is also part of the present. So, Jennifer, I'm going to put links to any articles that you point me to, and
Okay.
and yeah, I want to thank you for this. This is really interesting, and I hope that your research bears more fruit. I know for a fact that there are other people using the articles you've written to do further work on descendants in California, descendants of people like Maria Feliciana, and so it's all part of a growing body of knowledge that we're all going to benefit from. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code podcast, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.